The baby in your tummy is vengeful because it was abandoned. My 5-year-old daughter exclaimed this when she saw my heavily pregnant sister-in-law. My sister-in-law's face became troubled. Don't say weird things. I quickly covered my daughter's mouth and apologized to my sister-in-law. She laughed and said, "Kids nowadays have quite the sense of humor." At first, I assumed my daughter was simply being mischievous, but she wields a mysterious power, and something about her words unnerved me. When I looked up, I saw my brother, pale and trembling, as if he was afraid of something. Then unbelievable truths began to emerge. I had always disliked my brother David, who was 2 years older than me, since we were children. "Hey Bella, give me your book." David, who saw me as nothing more than a stress outlet, would call me Bella and hit me in the head on a daily basis. He also used me as a practice dummy for wrestling moves and stole my allowance. I faced numerous harassments. "Listen, if you tell Mom and Dad, I will make sure you cannot stay in this house." David always warned me like that, so I had no choice but to persevere. To avoid David, I began living alone as soon as I reached adulthood. Later, I met my current husband at work, married at 30, and the next year, our beloved daughter Genesis was born. I lived happily with my peaceful family, having completely forgotten my painful memories from the past, however, When Genesis turned 5, my parents informed me that David was getting married and that his wife Vivian would be there to greet us. I returned home with a heavy heart after seeing David for the first time in years. I almost recoiled from the shock. David, who had previously been tyrannical, had transformed into a kind person. Furthermore, Vivian, who was 36 like me, was upbeat and approachable. We quickly bonded over our shared love of reading. I'm glad David found such a good person. Since David and Vivian's new house was only a 15-minute drive away, we began lending and borrowing books. I hoped that our relationship with David would gradually improve, and I resolved not to dwell on the past. 6 months have passed, and Vivian informed me that she was pregnant. To celebrate, I went to her house with Genesis. "Hey, does Jillian have a baby in her tummy?" Genesis kept glancing at her belly as Vivian and I talked. "Yes, there is, but it is very small." Vivian rubbed her belly, clearly overjoyed with the baby. She must be really excited to have a child with David. I also wanted to give her as much support as I could. I left her house feeling as if I had shared in her happiness. The baby seemed strange. Genesis muttered this with a puzzled expression on her face as we stepped out of the house. What? What do you mean? The baby in her tummy was angry and it was frightening. Genesis furrowed her brow, puzzled. Perhaps she saw an ultrasound picture while I was in the bathroom. I thought and asked, but Genesis shook her head. "I actually saw it. It's impossible to look inside a tummy. That is what anyone would think." But I knew right away that she wasn't lying. Genesis actually possessed a mysterious power. For example, she accurately predicted a neighbor's pregnancy before the neighbor knew it, as well as illnesses in relatives. She'd been through similar situations before. So I paused in my tracks to ask her about it. "When, Bella?" David's sudden voice startled me, even though he is kind. The terrible treatment I had received in the past had become ingrained in my body, and hearing my name made me tense up. "Were you at our house?" "Yes, but we are leaving now." I turned around cautiously to see David, who appeared to be returning from work. He no longer had that frightening expression, and I breathed a sigh of relief. "Hello, David. Have you been playing with a woman?" Genesis, who was sitting next to me, looked up at David with curiosity. Suddenly, his expression became harsh. "What is the kid saying? How cheeky!" He muttered in a low voice and gave us a sharp, piercing look. It was the same David from before, and I was immediately drawn back into my old fears, unable to move as if paralyzed. "But there is lovely long hair on your shoulder? I am unaware of anything." Genesis innocently pointed at his shoulder. "No way. Do not say such nonsense." David, enraged, made a threatening gesture toward Genesis. "Genesis is going to be hit." I shouted, "Stop it!" as my previously immobile body moved instinctively. "Genesis is being shielded. Just kidding. Don't take it too seriously." He lowered his raised arm and brushed his shoulder, saying it was probably the hair of the female subordinate he had previously been with, while still staring at us. His expression was full of malice. Just like when he used to bully me, painful memories came flooding back. I was paralyzed again by fear. I stood there protecting Genesis when I heard Vivian's voice from a distance. Wait, you've forgotten something. She had graciously brought the toy Genesis had left behind. Oh, David, you're back. Welcome home. I'm home. David, who had a terrified expression just a moment ago, smiled and responded to Vivian in a cheerful tone, completely different than before. His sudden change made me shiver, so I grabbed the toy from Vivian and bolted, as if fleeing. Since that day, I found it difficult to visit David and Vivian's home. Despite this, I maintained occasional contact with Vivian. I used a variety of excuses to avoid meeting her directly. I received a message from her later when she was nearing the end of her pregnancy. David injured his leg and is unable to drive. She asked me to do her shopping, and I ended up going to David and Vivian's house for the first time in a while. You were a big help. Thank you. Vivian, who greeted us at the door, had a much larger belly than the last time we met and appeared to have trouble walking. Then Genesis, who had come with me, looked at Vivian's belly and muttered, "Baby, it's bigger than before, correct? Would you like to touch it?" Genesis's expression stiffened the moment she placed her hand on the belly. The baby in your belly is returning for vengeance because it was abandoned. Genesis made a terrifying statement while staring up at Vivian. Don't say weird things. I was so surprised that when I looked up, I quickly covered Genesis's mouth to apologize for the rude remark. Vivian unexpectedly smiled, as if she was impressed. Kids nowadays say the most amazing things. It's impressive that they understand such difficult words. She then patted Genesis's head. I wondered where she learned such words. As I removed my hand from Genesis's mouth, I suddenly remembered something. Did you imitate the villain on television? Who said I would get my revenge? What about the other day? Vivian nodded in agreement to my words, but Genesis shook her head violently. No. The baby is actually saying it. Genesis pointed earnestly at Vivian's belly, and she did not appear to be lying. Could Genesis represent a mysterious power or something? Just as a bad feeling entered my mind? I saw David behind Vivian. He was sweating profusely and trembling. Hello, what's going on here? He approached us with the sound of his crutches tapping, wearing that terrifying expression again. He grabbed Genesis's shoulder and violently shook her. Ouch! Stop it! Genesis burst into tears, taken aback by his fierce demeanor and the unexpected shock. Hearing her cry jolted me out of it, and I quickly drew her away from David. Hello, what's going on? Explain, or I will hit you. It was as if the old David was recalling my childhood fears. I hugged Genesis tightly to protect her. Vivian was taken aback by her husband's sudden change and grabbed his arm, exclaiming, What's going on? David was brought back to reality by her intervention. He seemed to realize what he had done. He then left the house on crutches, saying, I am going out for a bit. After David had left, Vivian spoke gently to Genesis. I apologize and invited us inside. She prepared hot chocolate to calm Genesis down. Why would you say something like that? Genesis, who had stopped crying, revealed something even more surprising. Vivian had a complex expression on her face as she listened to the Genesis story, saying, That has to be a joke, right? However, given David's earlier behavior, I was convinced it was true. Vivian, I need to tell you something. I couldn't keep it a secret any longer, and explained Genesis's mysterious power to her. Vivian, perplexed, looked back and forth between Genesis and me, thinking deeply for a while. I cannot believe Bella would lie. Actually, I've been bothered by David's serious expression. Vivian began telling me something. I realized I could not keep running away from David. Despite being terrified and unable to challenge him since childhood. I decided I had to stand up for Vivian and her unborn child. Soon after, I began researching David's background and discovered unbelievable details. I returned to David's house 2 weeks after my previous visit. You again? David, now fully recovered and able to walk normally, appeared annoyed when he saw me and attempted to leave the room. Wait a minute. I grabbed his arm to stop him, and he scowled, shaking my hand away. What do you want? He snapped. But I refused to let go and glared at him. David, are you having an affair? David's eyes widened as he shouted. What? There is no way to do that. Do not say such nonsense. Despite his words, he was visibly agitated, his eyes darting around. Vivian, on the other hand, remained calm and unconcerned about her husband's affair. I'd already told Vivian that David might be having an affair. When Genesis pointed out the long hair on David's shoulder, he claimed it belonged to a subordinate. I relayed this to her. Vivian then revealed, "Actually, I have some suspicions. Since Vivian became pregnant, you've been working late and calling women in the middle of the night. Have not you?" 4 became busier, and I had to meet with subordinates outside of regular hours. What is wrong with that? David quickly denied it, glaring at me. Oh, seriously? Do bosses and subordinates now hold meetings in hotels? I threw a photo at him of David and his mistress entering a hotel arm in arm. Following you around, I discovered a wealth of evidence. You quote, "V been having an affair with this woman since before your marriage. Have not you?" I scattered more photos on the table, showing them holding hands on dates and getting cozy in a car without worrying about being seen. These are photographs that have been maliciously altered. I have not betrayed Vivian. Still deny it, even though you made your mistress pregnant. David's face was the most terrified I'd ever seen, and he stammered, "Ugh, you subjected that baby to such a fate. Do not talk nonsense. Oh, did you forget what Genesis said back then?" David's face became pale, and his eyes darted around. That is why the baby returned to Vivian's womb seeking vengeance. That was only a kid's fantasy. He refused to admit it, but his words became increasingly disjointed. Genesis also told me that when the baby was born, you moved it far away. Genesis also stated that the baby's mother has long hair and the baby's father is David. David's face became increasingly paler, almost white. That is nonsense. David's tenacity appeared innate as he continued to shout and intimidate. Even now, a child's silly testimony is not evidence. He vehemently denied it and claimed his innocence. But despite the sweat on his brow, he continued to look into his eyes. I took a deep breath. Even if the child's testimony is not reliable, how about the mistress's testimony? I had already met the mistress in person 3 days prior. She worked at the same company as him and initially denied the affair with David. When I mentioned pursuing legal action for compensation, she admitted everything, saying she didn't want it to be a big deal. Apparently, David and the mistress's company has strict regulations, and personal problems can jeopardize promotions or even result in dismissal. Not knowing this in advance, I told her I was going to sue, and she quickly revealed the truth. "David, you told her, correct? That you get tired of ordinary meals every day and occasionally crave steak. Vivian was just another meal to David, whereas the mistress was a high-quality steak." He said this to invite his mistress while still engaged to Vivian. When Vivian heard this, she muttered mockingly, "What a terrible pickup line." I had the same thoughts. However, the mistress easily complied with this line. They continued their affair, and just as David was about to marry Vivian, the mistress's pregnancy was discovered. By the time she realized it, it was too late to abort, so she had to give birth. However, neither David nor the mistress wanted the child, so David proposed leaving the baby in front of a facility following birth. The mistress agreed and gave the baby to David, the day after being released from hospital. She was informed that the baby had been safely transported to the facility. However, the truth was different. David lied to his mistress and did terrible things to the baby. When I confronted him with this fact, David began to raise his voice. "That bitch lied to create confusion because she didn't want me to pay attention to Vivian. So you admitted to the affair?" David threw up his hands and sat back on the sofa, his legs crossed, realizing he could no longer deny it. "Yes, I had an affair, but I do not know anything about the child." He snorted and turned away. But I played a recording in front of him. In the recording, the mistress's voice asked, "Is our baby okay?" Following that, David's voice says, "I took the baby to the facility, so everything is fine." Why do you keep this recording? Parking your car in the park with the windows wide open is like asking someone to listen. David attempted to grab the recorder, but I quickly grabbed it back. David realized he couldn't get away any longer, but he still muttered, "It's fabricated. It is not me." He appeared desperate to leave the situation. "Why are you so adamant about not admitting this?" "Because telling the truth would be problematic." "What? You did take the baby to the mountains, didn't you?" When I revealed my final card, David was speechless. "Yes. David's claim of taking the baby to the facility was completely false. The truth was far more brutal. The baby had died. How? How do you know this? Genesis told me. The baby in her womb said so. That's why it returned seeking vengeance. David's face paled at my words. His stiff expression provided the most telling evidence. I remained firm in front of the trembling David. Genesis also told me where the baby came from, that mountain. When I heard this from Genesis, I immediately contacted the police. However, they dismissed it as a child's prank and did not take it seriously. So I gathered a few trusted friends and decided to search the mountain together. When I showed Genesis a map of the mountain, she pointed out the location, and we discovered the tragic remains. How could you do such a horrible thing? It is inhuman. I tried to remain calm, but remembering the baby caused my vision to blur with shock. The thought of the baby's unjust death broke my heart. I found myself in tears without realizing it. Standing next to me, Vivian looked pained and patted my back. So, what did you do next? David inquired with his eyes. I ensured the baby was properly laid to rest. That's not what I intended, he yelled desperately. I knew exactly what he wanted to hear. Of course, I reported it to the police. I told them everything. You are a meddling fool. David was more concerned with himself than the baby's fate. I was convinced that he deserved to be thoroughly punished. You will be arrested once the charges have been confirmed. Damn it! Everything was supposed to run smoothly. David held his head in despair and showed no remorse or regret. He was simply lamenting that everything had been exposed. Vivian muttered, "He's truly hopeless, obviously. And if I divorce you, I will ensure that I receive alimony and child support." Vivian looked at David in disgust and said, "I'll also claim from the mistress, so let her know." Wait a minute, I did it all for you. He grabbed Vivian's arm. She shook off his hand, looking at him with contempt. If I refresh myself with an affair, I can face you with a new perspective, which will lead to a harmonious family, right? Actually, our family has already been broken as a result of your actions. As she calmly responded, David exclaimed, "It's Bella's fault. If I had left the child at the facility, it could have grown up and come looking for me. If Vivian found out, she would be devastated. Do not use me as an excuse to avoid responsibility." Vivian became enraged by his selfishness. She raised her hand and slapped David on the cheek with a loud smack. David uttered a foolish sound. "Repent and make amends for your sins, so that this child is no longer consumed by hatred." With her hand on her belly, Vivian's eyes welled up with tears as she shouted, and large tears streamed down her cheeks. She whispered, "I'll definitely make this child happy," representing the strong image of a mother protecting her child. Oh, what have I done? Seeing her, David realized he had been abandoned and collapsed to his knees, sobbing. As I watched David, anger welled up inside of me. I blurted out, "Don't cry. You do not even have the right to cry." David looked up with a tear-stained face and muttered, "I'm sorry, but it is too late to apologize now. You should spend the remainder of your life repenting." Giving him the coldest look I'd ever given. He sobbed and collapsed like an empty shell. As if on cue, police sirens sounded from afar. I gestured to Vivian with my eyes before leaving the house, ignoring David's stunned expression. Shortly after David was arrested and sentenced to a lengthy prison term, Vivian divorced him and demanded $150,000 in alimony and child support for the unborn child. My relatives covered this amount, saying they would make David work tirelessly to repay it once he was released from prison. She also demanded $20,000 in compensation from the mistress, which was paid right away. Vivian later gave birth safely to the baby. Genesis first met the child. She stated that there is nothing scary anymore. "You are adorable," and patted the baby's head, bringing tears to Vivian's and my eyes. We intended to continue supporting this baby so that it would grow up healthy and strong.